A man lies collapsed on the cold marble floor of Naples International Airport. It is January 26, 1962. His expensive overcoat folds around him like the remnants of a forgotten empire. The bystanders don't recognize him immediately, just another traveler who fell ill, but when the police arrive and search his pockets, they find papers that tell a different story. The passport reads, Charles Luciano. In that instant, the legend of the American underworld takes its final breath. The Kingmaker is dead. The camera lingers on his lifeless face, part nobleman, part ghost. It's almost poetic. This is how the man who built the American Mafia ends. Not in a hail of bullets, not in a courtroom, but quietly, in exile, thousands of miles from the streets he once ruled. The whispers begin immediately. Was it a heart attack or something darker? Did his past finally catch up to him, or had he simply become irrelevant, a relic of another age? In the silence that follows, one question remains. How did Charles "Lucky" Luciano, the man who organized chaos itself, end up here, alone, betrayed, and forgotten? To answer that, we must go back to a time when America was roaring with money, violence, and ambition. The 1920s. A decade drenched in jazz and whiskey, when morality was just another rule to be broken. Beneath the glittering skyline of New York City, a new world was being carved out in the shadows. A world where gangsters were businessmen, corruption was currency, and loyalty could be bought or sold for the right price. It was in this world that Lucky Luciano rose, not by strength but by vision. He wasn't the strongest or even the most feared. But he saw something others didn't. While other mobsters were still fighting over street corners and speakeasies, Luciano was studying systems. How power moved, how money flowed, how people could be organized, controlled, and replaced. To him, crime wasn't chaos. It was business. And business, when managed correctly, could last forever. But every empire begins with blood. Luciano's rise was born in the aftermath of violence and betrayal, during a time when bosses like Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano ruled with fists of iron and codes of silence. The old Sicilian traditions demanded blind loyalty. Luciano offered something else: efficiency, order, and opportunity. He saw that the Mafia could be more than a network of feuding families. It could be an institution, modern, structured, and untouchable. As the story unfolds, we'll see the boy from Sicily who became the architect of organized crime in America. We'll walk the crowded tenements of the Lower East Side, where young immigrants fought for survival. We'll enter smoke-filled backrooms where power was traded like currency. We'll witness the creation of the Commission, the corporate council of the underworld. And we'll watch as that same brilliance, the gift that made him king, also becomes the weapon that destroys him. Because Lucky Luciano's life is more than a story of crime. It is a story of vision, ambition, and the inevitable decay that follows unchecked power. His world was built on loyalty, yet defined by betrayal. His genius created order, but his pride invited downfall. In the end, the man who once controlled the American Mafia found himself trapped by the very system he designed, betrayed not by his enemies but by his own success. This is not just the story of Lucky Luciano. It's the story of America's shadow, a place where the lines between crime and capitalism blur, where morality bends beneath the weight of ambition, and where every king eventually meets his reckoning. From the crowded streets of New York to the sunlit exile of Naples, this journey will trace the rise and fall of the man who turned the Mafia into a modern empire, and the fateful choices that turned its kingmaker into its final casualty. The story of Lucky Luciano cannot begin with him, it must begin with the world that made him possible. Before Luciano's vision reshaped the American underworld, the world of organized crime was anything but organized. It was chaotic, fragmented, and bloody. The year was 1920, and America had just done something extraordinary. It had outlawed alcohol. The Volstead Act, better known as Prohibition, promised to make the nation sober and moral. Instead, it gave birth to a black market worth billions. And in that forbidden marketplace, men with no pedigree, no schooling, and no fear found a new kind of power. Liquor flowed like rivers beneath the surface of respectable society. In every city, New York, Chicago, Boston, hidden bars called speakeasies became sanctuaries for those who could afford the thrill of breaking the law. Behind every bottle of whiskey smuggled from Canada, behind every shipment unloaded in the dead of night, stood an army of bootleggers, thieves, and killers. But there was no unity among them. The underworld was divided by ethnicity, territory, and pride. Irish gangs controlled the docks and the politics. Jewish syndicates ran gambling and finance. Italian families, bound by old country codes, guarded their neighborhoods like fortresses. Every block was a battlefield. In New York, two men ruled above the rest: Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano. They were relics of Sicily, men who believed in the ancient traditions of omerta, silence, blood loyalty and vengeance. Their soldiers fought in the streets with shotguns and Tommy guns, spilling blood for a handful of corners or a shipment of liquor. To them crime was personal, tribal. Power came from fear and respect was measured in funerals. It was an old world system transplanted into a new world that was changing too fast for its own rules. But the America of the 1920s was not Sicily. It was a nation of speed and invention, automobiles, telephones, jazz, skyscrapers. Money was no longer just for the elite, it was there for anyone bold enough to grab it. The gangsters of the new generation saw opportunity in this chaos. They dressed like businessmen, made deals like bankers and thought like entrepreneurs. Among them, a young man named Charles "Lucky" Luciano began to stand out, not for his brutality but for his clarity. Luciano watched the gang wars unfold like a chessboard. To him, the endless bloodshed was bad for business. Every assassination drew attention. Every feud scared off partners. He saw that loyalty, as the old bosses defined it, was killing them. He began asking dangerous questions. Why fight over one street when you can control an entire city? Why rule by fear when profit could bind men together more tightly than honor ever could? These were revolutionary thoughts for their time, heresy in the old mafia world. As the decade roared on, prohibition turned small-time criminals into millionaires. Al Capone rose in Chicago, his empire built on the same illegal liquor that flooded New York. Politicians were bought, cops were bribed, and judges looked the other way. The line between legitimate business and organized crime blurred until it practically disappeared. In the glittering clubs of Manhattan, bootleggers and bankers shared the same tables. The criminal became the celebrity and the law itself seemed negotiable. Yet, beneath the glamour, the system was rotting. The bootlegging profits were too large, the egos too violent. Men who had once been allies turned into enemies overnight. Bombs exploded outside restaurants. Bodies appeared in alleys. Even among the Italian families, whispers of betrayal were constant. Every leader feared that one of his own men might be secretly talking to the police, or worse, to his rivals. This was the world Luciano studied, quietly, patiently. He didn't seek to destroy it, he sought to master it. He saw that the old mafia's reliance on family and tradition made it weak. It could not adapt to the modern world because it was trapped in its own mythology. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to blend old-world loyalty with new-world ambition. He began forming connections beyond his own ethnicity, deals with Jewish gangsters like Meyer Lansky and Benny Siegel, and arrangements with Irish enforcers and corrupt politicians. In his mind, crime was not Italian, Jewish, or Irish, it was American. The irony is that while America was trying to enforce morality through law, men like Luciano were creating a shadow version of the American dream, one built on risk, ingenuity, and profit. In a strange way, they mirrored the businessmen of Wall Street, ambitious, ruthless, and always looking for the next opportunity. The streets of New York became the new frontier, and Luciano was already mapping it in his mind. As the decade came to a close, the storm clouds gathered. The Castellamarese War, an all-out conflict between Masuria and Maranzano, was about to erupt. The old ways and the new were on a collision course, and Luciano stood between them, preparing to choose a side, or perhaps to end the sides altogether. This was the world before Lucky Luciano truly became lucky. A world of blood and bootleg whiskey, of greed and fear. A world waiting for someone to bring order to its chaos. And in that darkness, the young Sicilian from the Lower East Side was quietly preparing to do exactly that, to turn crime into a system, and himself into its kingmaker. He was born Salvatore Lucania in 1897, in a small Sicilian town called Lercara Fritti, a place where poverty wasn't a condition but a birthright. His father was a sulfur miner, his mother a devout woman who dreamed her son might one day escape the harshness of the island. When the Lucania family boarded a ship for America in 1906, they weren't chasing wealth, they were chasing survival. Like millions of immigrants, they arrived at Ellis Island with little more than faith and hunger. For the 8-year-old boy clutching his mother's hand, New York was supposed to be salvation. Instead, it became his battlefield. The Lower East Side in those years was a world unto itself, a dense warren of tenements packed with Italians, Jews, Irish, and Poles. The streets stank of sweat, sewage, and desperation. Kids learned to fight before they learned to read. Money was scarce and respect was earned one way, through fear. This was the America that shaped Luciano. He quickly learned that schoolbooks would not feed him, and that the streets offered lessons no classroom could. By his teens, Young Salvatore had already dropped out of school and found work running errands for neighborhood gangs. He gambled, sold dope, and extorted protection money from the smaller kids. It wasn't cruelty, it was currency. In the lawless sprawl of immigrant Manhattan, strength meant survival. His name changed too. Salvatore Lucania became Charlie Luciano, easier for Americans to pronounce, harder for the world to trace. But the turning point came when he met another street hustler, a boy of Jewish descent named Meyer Lansky. Lansky wasn't a fighter, he was a thinker, analytical, calm with a gift for numbers. The two were opposites in background but twins in ambition. They understood each other in ways that transcended race or religion. Where most kids saw street corners, they saw opportunity. Where others stole coins, they imagined empires. Their bond became the first thread in a web that would later connect every major criminal enterprise in New York. In the nights that followed, Luciano's circle grew to include names that would later echo through Mafia history: Benjamin Bugsy, Siegel, Frank Costello, Vito Genovese. Together they were the new breed, Americanized, pragmatic, and impatient with the old Sicilian hierarchies that demanded obedience without reward. They didn't bow to Mustache Pete's, the traditionalists who clung to rituals and codes of honor. Luciano and his friends believed in profit, not pride. Still, respect had to be earned, and Luciano earned his the hard way. In 1920, while running liquor shipments during the early days of Prohibition, he was kidnapped by rival gangsters, beaten, stabbed, and left for dead on Staten Island beach. Somehow he survived, scarred but alive. The attack left his face partially paralyzed, giving him the crooked smile that would one day become his trademark. From that day on, he was called Lucky. But those who knew him best said luck had nothing to do with it. He was calm in chaos, a man who could make a deal with death and still come out ahead. That experience hardened him, not just physically but psychologically. He understood now that power was fragile, that alliances were temporary, and that survival required more than loyalty. It demanded control. When he looked around, he saw men dying for bosses who would never remember their names. He swore he would never be one of them. He would be the man giving the orders, not taking them. By his mid-20s, Luciano was moving in circles that connected him to every major racket in New York: bootlegging, gambling, narcotics, and prostitution. He became a trusted lieutenant under Joe Masuria, one of the old Sicilian bosses who ruled Little Italy through terror. But Luciano wasn't satisfied being anyone's subordinate. Behind his polite smile, he studied every operation, every weakness, every personality around him. He learned that power wasn't just about fear, it was about balance. Control the flow of money, control the men who handle it, and you control everything. At the same time, Luciano was becoming fluent in both worlds, the street and the society above it. He wore fine suits, smoked expensive cigarettes, and cultivated friendships with politicians and nightclub owners. He could talk like a gangster or a gentleman depending on who was listening. That duality became his greatest weapon. In a world where most criminals flaunted their brutality, Luciano disguised his as charm. But beneath the polish there was a restlessness. He saw how the old mafia bosses refused to adapt, clinging to feudal traditions that made no sense in modern America. They distrusted outsiders, hated Jews, and dismissed anyone who wasn't born in Sicily. Luciano, meanwhile, saw the potential in collaboration, not just among Italians but across ethnic lines. To him, Lansky and Siegel weren't outsiders, they were partners. Together, they were inventing a new kind of underworld, one that operated like a multinational business long before the term existed. And yet, every dream comes with a shadow. Luciano's rise attracted attention, from rivals, from police, from ambitious politicians looking to make names for themselves. He knew that his survival depended on staying one step ahead of everyone, friends and enemies alike. His philosophy became simple: if I can't trust loyalty, I'll trust logic. And logic says everyone wants money. By the end of the 1920s, the boy from the Sicilian slums had transformed into something new, a criminal visionary. He was no longer just another gangster running whiskey or running from cops. He was studying systems, how to make crime scalable, predictable, and sustainable. The streets of the Lower East Side had given him his education, but now he was ready for graduation. The old world was crumbling under its own weight, and Lucky Luciano was waiting to build something new from its ashes. The kid who once bullied other children for nickels was about to become the architect of an empire. And as America danced through its age of jazz and gin, the underworld was quietly being rewritten, one calculated move at a time, by a man who believed he could turn chaos into order and loyalty into profit. By the early 1930s, Charles "Lucky" Luciano had become more than a name whispered in the shadows. He was a force that reshaped the very structure of organized crime in America. The lessons of the street had crystallized into a philosophy. Loyalty was useful, but power required order. The Mafia, as he saw it, could not survive on superstition and sentiment. It needed structure, rules, and most of all, purpose. Luciano wasn't interested in being a traditional gangster. He wanted to be something far more enduring, a man who could make the underworld run like a business empire. But to build that empire, he first had to destroy the old one. The early 1930s were consumed by what history would later call the Castellamarese War, a brutal civil conflict that pitted two aging mafia dons against each other. Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano. Both were products of the old world, relics of Sicily's rigid hierarchy and blood feuds. Their soldiers died by the dozens in gunfights across New York, all in the name of honor and territory. To Luciano it was insanity, a waste of time and money. Yet he was trapped inside it, serving as a trusted lieutenant under Masuria, while secretly questioning the man's every move. Masuria believed in dominance through fear. He ruled with suspicion, surrounding himself with loyalists who told him what he wanted to hear. Luciano, outwardly obedient, played the long game. He began meeting secretly with Maranzano's men, sending quiet signals that the future belonged to neither of the aging bosses. To Luciano, both Masuria and Maranzano represented the same problem. They ruled for themselves, not for the system. Their greed blinded them to the possibilities of unity, of turning fragmented gangs into a national organization that could coordinate profit, avoid conflict, and expand without chaos. In 1931, Luciano made his move. He lured Joe Masuria to a quiet restaurant in Coney Island, under the pretense of peace talks. After a few hands of cards, Luciano excused himself to use the bathroom. When he returned, Masuria lay dead, shot multiple times by men Luciano himself had arranged. Bugsy Siegel, Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, and Joe Adonis. The message was clear: the old guard was finished. In one calculated act of betrayal, Luciano not only eliminated his boss but signaled the dawn of a new era. But if Masuria's death marked the end of one tyrant, Maranzano quickly positioned himself as the next. Declaring himself Capo di Tutti Capi, the boss of all bosses, Maranzano tried to impose order by reinstating old Sicilian traditions and ranking every family beneath him. He fancied himself a Caesar, reorganizing the Mafia into 5 New York families and placing himself at the top of the pyramid. To the public it looked like progress. To Luciano it was just another dictatorship in a new suit. Luciano played along at first, smiling politely, attending Maranzano's meetings, pretending to be the loyal protege. But behind the calm demeanor he was already planning another strike. Maranzano's arrogance made him careless. He began calling Luciano too American, and worse, he ordered his assassination, a fatal mistake. Luciano's network moved faster. In September 1931, Maranzano was killed in his office by men disguised as tax agents. They stabbed and shot him before he could even reach for his gun. Within hours, the title boss of all bosses was abolished, forever. What Luciano did next would change organized crime forever. Instead of claiming the throne, he destroyed it. In its place, he built the Commission, a governing body made up of representatives from the major mafia families, designed to resolve disputes, manage territories, and enforce peace. It was, in essence, a board of directors for organized crime. Each family would have autonomy, but all would be bound by mutual interest. Violence would require approval. Profit would be shared. Rules would be written not in blood, but in understanding. This was Luciano's genius. He replaced tyranny with bureaucracy, chaos with consensus. In doing so, he ensured that no single man, not even himself, could threaten the organization's survival. It was an extraordinary act of vision, one that transformed gangs into a national network capable of influencing unions, businesses, and even politics. The Mafia became a system, efficient, scalable, and disturbingly modern. The Commission wasn't just a crime syndicate, it was a reflection of America's capitalist soul. Luciano borrowed principles from legitimate corporations: balance of power, partnerships, risk management. He even adopted the language of business. Instead of family wars, there were disputes. Instead of rackets, there were enterprises. He referred to the Mafia as our organization. To the FBI, this language was confusing. To Luciano, it was camouflage. Behind his calm professionalism, however, lay the same ruthlessness that had brought him here. Luciano's version of peace was enforced peace. Anyone who broke the Commission's rules met a swift, silent death. His alliance with Jewish mobsters like Lansky and Siegel ensured that his reach extended beyond the Italian underworld. Together they invested in casinos, shipping, construction and labor unions. Luciano had successfully turned criminal enterprise into corporate infrastructure. And for the first time in history the American Mafia operated not as a loose collection of gangs, but as a unified system. Yet this transformation came with a cost. The men who had followed Luciano out of loyalty began to fear his intellect more than his power. He had rewritten their world, but he had also made himself indispensable. Without him the system might crumble, with him no one else could rise. His brilliance isolated him. In a world built on loyalty, he had created something cold and mechanical, a machine that served no master but profit. Still, in the early 1930s Lucky Luciano was untouchable. To the outside world, he was a well-dressed businessman who owned nightclubs and mingled with movie stars. To the underworld he was the architect of modern crime, the man who turned blood into business, betrayal into structure. The Mafia was now an empire, and Luciano stood at its center, not as a king but as the Kingmaker, the man who proved that power was not seized by violence alone, but by vision, timing, and the courage to betray the past. What he didn't yet realize was that every empire, no matter how carefully built, carries the seeds of its own destruction. The system he created would outlive him, but it would also, one day, turn against him. For now, though, Lucky Luciano was everything he had ever dreamed of becoming. The invisible hand behind the American underworld, a man who could make peace with a phone call and erase enemies with a whisper. The Mafia had always been more than crime. It was culture, psychology, and ritual. But under Lucky Luciano, it became something colder, an institution built on efficiency, not emotion. Still, even the most modern organization needed a moral skeleton to hold it together. For Luciano that framework was omerta, the ancient Sicilian code of silence. Yet, while the old dons worshipped omerta as sacred law, Luciano saw it differently. To him it wasn't about honor. It was about control. In the Italy of his parents, omerta was a code born of survival. It meant absolute loyalty to one's family and total secrecy in the face of authority. A man who spoke to the police was not merely a traitor, he was the walking dead. Families would erase their own sons for breaking it. In Sicily, silence was protection. But in America, where power could be bought and sold, silence became a weapon. Luciano understood this better than anyone. He didn't need soldiers who believed in honor. He needed men who feared the consequences of betrayal. He transformed omerta into a management tool. Under his rule, every associate understood one simple truth: the organization's survival depended on silence. Talk to no one, trust only the family, and obey without question. This wasn't about culture anymore, it was strategy. Information was the new currency, and Luciano guarded it like gold. Even within the 5 families, no one knew everything. Each crew handled its own business, and only a select few, the capos and lieutenants, knew how the system truly worked. It was compartmentalization on a grand scale, designed to make the organization unbreakable. To outsiders it looked like honor among thieves. To insiders it was psychological warfare. Luciano cultivated fear but not chaos. He believed in rules, clear, unemotional rules. A man who stole from the organization didn't get shouted at or humiliated. He simply disappeared. A man who talked to the police might find himself greeted by a smiling friend one moment, and face down in an alley the next. Justice in Luciano's empire was silent and swift. Yet beneath this cold logic, there was a strange kind of morality, a twisted sense of order in an immoral world. Luciano often said that he hated unnecessary killing. Violence to him was wasteful. It drew headlines, brought heat, disrupted business. He wanted stability, predictability, discipline. Murder was simply the last option in the cost of doing business. When his men killed, they did it not for revenge but for efficiency. "We're businessmen," he told them once. "We don't shoot people for nothing. We shoot people for a reason." It was this balance of brutality and restraint that made Luciano's Mafia so dangerous. Under him, the organization wasn't just a gang, it was a system of belief. Every soldier knew his role, his limits, and the punishment for crossing them. Betrayal was unforgivable. Weakness was fatal. But loyalty, true, unshakable loyalty, was rewarded with protection, money, and respect. For many, joining Luciano's organization offered something they had never had before: identity. In a society that treated poor immigrants as expendable, the Mafia gave them purpose and brotherhood. Luciano understood that psychology instinctively. He made his men feel seen, even as he controlled them completely. In his private moments, Luciano liked to compare his organization to the Catholic Church, another hierarchy built on fear, faith, and ritual. "We got our priests, our bishops, our pope," he once joked. "And everybody pays their dues." But beneath the humor was truth. Like the church, the Mafia demanded confession, sacrifice, and absolute obedience. It offered belonging but at a terrible price, the loss of one's own will. Luciano's genius was that he turned morality into management. Omerta wasn't just a rule of silence, it was a psychological cage. Every man who joined the organization did so knowing he could never leave it. Even if he wanted out, even if he changed, the oath held him prisoner. When new members were initiated, they swore on a burning saint's card, promising eternal loyalty to the family. The ceremony was both sacred and terrifying. A single drop of blood on the card symbolized that the oath was sealed in life and death. To break it was to die. But Luciano's modern mind couldn't ignore the irony. He had built a structure that relied on loyalty, yet he himself had risen to power through betrayal. He had killed his own bosses, outsmarted his mentors, and rewritten the rules of crime. Deep down, he knew that Omerta was fragile, that silence lasted only as long as fear did. So he made fear permanent. His relationships reflected this paradox. With Meyer Lansky, the friendship was built on mutual respect, an alliance of equals. With Vito Genovese and Frank Costello, it was transactional. Each man knew that trust had an expiration date. They admired Luciano's brilliance, but they also feared it. He was unpredictable, not because he was reckless but because he was always thinking 10 steps ahead. When he smiled, no one knew if it was from genuine warmth or quiet calculation. Under Luciano, the Mafia began to resemble a corporation run by sociologists. He introduced councils to mediate disputes, protocols for settling debts, even unwritten rules for how to conduct killings. Emotions were outlawed. Revenge was no longer a right, it was a liability. In doing so, he made the organization far more stable than any before it. But he also stripped it of something human. The Mafia became a machine and he was its cold, efficient engineer. Still, Omerta, that ancient whisper of silence, gave the illusion of nobility. It allowed men who committed crimes to see themselves as part of something greater. It disguised greed as loyalty, violence as justice. And as long as that illusion held, Luciano's empire thrived. But in time, the code he weaponized would betray him just as he had betrayed others. The silence he demanded from others would one day turn against him, not through words, but through the deafening quiet of abandonment. For now, though, Omerta worked like iron. It bound his empire tighter than any law could. It created order out of chaos, discipline out of greed. The old dons had ruled with tradition, Luciano ruled with systems. And within that system, silence was more powerful than any bullet. By the mid-1930s, Lucky Luciano's empire was no longer confined to smoky backrooms and shadowed alleyways. It had become a sprawling network of influence that reached into every corner of American life. What he built was nothing short of revolutionary. A criminal conglomerate that operated with the precision of a Fortune 500 company. And at the heart of it all was Luciano himself, a man who understood that real power wasn't in violence but in control. He ran his empire like a strategist, not a gangster. His profits came from dozens of interconnected ventures: gambling, prostitution, narcotics, labor racketeering, loan sharking, and the unions. Each business fed into another, creating a cycle of dependency that made the entire system self-sustaining. The brilliance lay in how invisible it was. The money moved through fronts, shell companies, and legitimate investments. Politicians took campaign donations. Cops received tips. Judges were quietly bought. It was corruption so refined it almost looked like governance. Luciano's first major innovation was in prostitution, a business that, until then, had been chaotic and brutal. He transformed it into an organized operation known as the Combination. Dozens of brothels across New York operated under his protection, paying fixed fees for security, legal bribes, and guaranteed clientele. He brought order to what had been chaos. Girls were rotated, territories were defined, and prices standardized. What had once been a scattered street-level hustle became a city-wide industry. Made millions. Next came gambling. Luciano and his partners, Lansky, Siegel, and Costello, saw the potential of numbers rackets, dice games, and betting parlors not as petty crimes, but as legitimate enterprises. They installed accountants to track profits, bookkeepers to record transactions, and layers of management that insulated the top bosses from direct involvement. Even the violence that accompanied gambling was managed. Disputes were handled by mediators instead of hitmen. Every detail was controlled to ensure one thing: Business continuity. The Mafia under Luciano had a hierarchy of efficiency. At the top were the bosses and capos, men who didn't touch the dirty work but orchestrated it. Beneath them were the soldiers, who executed orders with military discipline. Every man took a cut and every dollar found its way upward. The brilliance of the system was that it made the organization self-regulating. Betrayal was rare not just because of fear, but because everyone was invested in its success. Luciano's control extended beyond crime itself. He infiltrated labor unions, the lifeblood of America's working class. The docks, construction sites, and trucking companies became his silent strongholds. By manipulating union leaders through bribes or intimidation, he could halt or move goods across the country. With a single phone call, he could stop shipments of steel, shut down entire industries, or ensure that rival businesses went bankrupt. It was economic warfare disguised as labor management. Politicians, too, became part of the equation. Luciano didn't just buy influence, he built relationships. He understood that money was persuasive, but favors created loyalty. When city councilmen or judges needed campaign funds, he provided them. When they needed votes, he delivered through union channels. In return, investigations vanished, charges dissolved, and raids were delayed. The system didn't just protect him, it depended on him. But with power came paranoia. Luciano understood that control was a fragile illusion. Every empire, no matter how disciplined, relied on the obedience of men with their own ambitions. To maintain dominance, he cultivated a network of spies within his own organization. He encouraged rivalry just enough to keep his subordinates occupied. He wanted them to compete for his approval, not his position. It was psychological management, divide and rule dressed in silk. Still, even he couldn't completely silence the unease. Men like Vito Genovese and Albert Anastasia began dreaming of their own thrones. Luciano knew their loyalty was transactional, built on fear and profit, not respect. He used charm as a weapon, humor as armor. In public he was calm, even gracious. But in private he never forgot that trust was the rarest commodity in his world. Despite the danger, there was a strange sophistication to how Luciano viewed himself. He didn't see his empire as a criminal enterprise, but as an inevitable byproduct of capitalism. In his eyes he wasn't defying America, he was perfecting it. The government, he once remarked, runs on bribes, favors, and connections, same as us. Only difference is we're honest about it. It was cynical, but it wasn't wrong. In many ways, Luciano's underworld mirrored the corporate elite, structured, exploitative, and obsessed with growth. His reach stretched beyond New York. Through the commission, he coordinated activities with families in Chicago, Philadelphia, and even Los Angeles. The Mafia was becoming a national network with policies, protocols, and quarterly meetings. They discussed territory like real estate developers and market opportunities like Wall Street traders. The American Mafia had matured, and Luciano was its architect. But beneath the calm surface, cracks were beginning to form. The same efficiency that made his empire thrive also made it vulnerable to exposure. The more organized the system became, the more visible its patterns were to outsiders. Law enforcement, for the first time, began to notice connections between arrests in different cities. Newspapers whispered about a national crime syndicate. Luciano had made the Mafia more powerful, but he had also made it traceable. There were other dangers too. The very success of his prostitution empire began to attract unwanted attention from reformers and ambitious prosecutors. One name in particular would soon become his nemesis, Thomas E. Dewey, a young, relentless district attorney with a reputation for integrity and a taste for headlines. Dewey's crusade against organized vice would ignite the first flames of Luciano's downfall. For now, though, lucky Luciano stood at the height of his reign. He was 35 years old, elegant, confident, and feared by everyone who mattered. He dined at the Waldorf, attended Broadway shows, and met with Hollywood producers. Politicians sought his favor. Journalists speculated about his mystique. The police knew his name but never his location. To the public he was invisible, yet his hand was in everything. His empire had become the model of organized crime, clean, structured, and profitable. It was a kingdom built not on chaos but on calculation. And at its center was a man who believed he had mastered human nature, who thought he could keep loyalty bought, silence maintained, and power eternal. But power, like faith, is fragile. The same structure that gave Luciano invincibility was also what would one day expose him. The machine he built was too big to hide, too perfect to last. And as the 1930s rolled on, the world outside, the government, the press, and the people, began to turn its gaze toward the shadow empire that ran beneath America's glittering surface. By the late 1930s, Lucky Luciano had built something that no gangster before him had ever achieved. A criminal empire that stretched coast to coast, run with the discipline of an international corporation. But every empire, no matter how powerful, carries the seeds of its own destruction. In Luciano's world, those seeds were men, proud, ambitious, and ruthless, each of them loyal only as long as it suited their interests. The alliances he forged to build his empire would soon become the same ones that threatened to tear it apart. For Luciano, alliances were never about friendship. They were about necessity. His partnership with Meyer Lansky, the quiet Jewish mastermind, was the most stable, built on intellect and mutual respect. Lansky had no illusions about power or ego. He wanted money and efficiency, not headlines. Together, they were the brains behind the modern mafia. Lansky handled the finances and the logistics. Luciano handled the politics and the blood. Their friendship was symbiotic. Luciano trusted him in ways he trusted no Italian. Meyer thinks before he moves, Lucky once said. That's why he's still alive. Then there was Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, Lansky's childhood friend and Luciano's wild card. Siegel was everything Lansky wasn't: brash, impulsive, magnetic. He was a killer who loved the spotlight, a man who dressed like a movie star and acted like one. Luciano admired his courage but feared his recklessness. Bugsy brought muscle and intimidation when words failed, but his thirst for attention was a liability. In private, Luciano often said, "Bugsy's got the balls of a bull, but one day they'll get him killed." Closer to home, Lucky's most complicated relationships were with his own Italian counterparts. Men like Vito Genovese and Frank Costello. Genovese was ambitious, calculating, and quietly envious of Luciano's charm. He had helped Lucky consolidate power during the bloody Castellamarese War, but his loyalty was more opportunistic than genuine. Genovese dreamed of replacing Luciano one day, not by betrayal but by inevitability. He believed that power was temporary and that every king eventually had to fall. Frank Costello, on the other hand, was a different breed. Smooth-talking, urbane, and politically connected, Costello preferred backroom deals to street violence. He was Luciano's bridge to the legitimate world, the man who whispered in politicians' ears and made sure laws bent where bullets couldn't reach. Costello respected Luciano but also saw his weaknesses, especially his growing arrogance. "Charlie," he would say, "you don't need to scare people when you already own them." The alliances worked because Luciano managed them like a chessboard, balancing fear with reward, rivalry with cooperation. He was the center of the web and every strand led back to him. But power built on ego is delicate, and cracks began to appear in the foundation. As the money poured in, the old unity started to fray. Everyone wanted more control, more respect, more recognition. One of the first fissures came from outside the Italian-Jewish partnership, from Dutch Schultz, the volatile bootlegger-turned-mobster who controlled Harlem's numbers racket. Schultz was brilliant but unstable. He made money faster than anyone, but he also made enemies faster. When Thomas E. Dewey began his crusade against organized crime, Schultz became his primary target. Schultz proposed the unthinkable, assassinating Dewey before he could bring indictments. Luciano was horrified. Killing a prosecutor, especially one as public as Dewey, would bring the full force of the government down on all of them. He summoned the commission, the ruling body he had created, and made a decision that shocked everyone. Dutch Schultz would die. It was a test of Luciano's authority and his vision. He chose the organization over friendship, the future over impulse. Within days, Schultz was gunned down in a Newark restaurant. The message was clear. The Mafia was no longer a mob of gangsters. It was a government of killers who killed only for policy. But the Dutch Schultz affair had consequences. It showed Luciano's partners, especially men like Genovese and Anastasia, just how cold and calculating he truly was. If he could kill one of his most profitable allies for the good of the system, what was to stop him from doing the same to them? Fear kept them in line, but fear also breeds resentment. Meanwhile, Luciano's power and visibility continued to grow. He dressed impeccably, dined with celebrities, and flaunted his influence in ways that made the old dons uneasy. To the press he was a ghost. To the public he didn't exist. But to everyone in New York's underworld, he was the man. That kind of dominance creates both reverence and jealousy, the two most combustible emotions in the criminal psyche. Vito Genovese began quietly positioning himself as Luciano's eventual successor. He whispered doubts among the capos, suggesting that Lucky's taste for luxury was blinding him. Genovese was more traditional, more Sicilian. He believed that Luciano had become too American, too trusting of non-Italians like Lansky and Siegel. "He's forgotten where he came from," Genovese reportedly said. "One day he'll pay for that." At the same time, Albert Anastasia, the terrifying enforcer known as the Lord High Executioner, grew restless. As head of Murder Incorporated, Anastasia oversaw the Mafia's enforcement arm, handling executions across the country. He was loyal to Luciano, but his loyalty was transactional. Anastasia's loyalty could shift as easily as the direction of a gun. Luciano kept him close, not out of affection but to keep an eye on him. The delicate balance that held the Mafia together began to wobble. Luciano was surrounded by men who smiled at him in public and plotted against him in private. Each believed he could run the empire better, smarter, stronger. But Luciano's greatest asset, his ability to outthink his rivals, still protected him. He sensed the shifts in loyalty before they surfaced, played rivals against one another, and always stayed 2 moves ahead. For now the king still ruled. Yet there was one force he couldn't manipulate, the law. While Luciano's enemies schemed in the shadows, Thomas E. Dewey was building a public crusade in the light. Using informants, raids, and financial records, Dewey's team began mapping the structure of organized vice in New York. For the first time the police had a target with a name. They didn't know the full extent of Luciano's empire, but they knew enough to start tearing at its edges. And so, the stage was set for collision between Luciano's inner circle of power and the relentless force of American justice. The alliances that had once made him untouchable would soon unravel under pressure. Trust would crumble, friends would turn, and the man who had mastered control would finally face a world he couldn't manipulate. Luciano's empire, built on loyalty, was beginning to rot from within. His allies were now his rivals were now his potential executioners, and the government was closing in. For a man who believed he had mastered every angle of power, the next chapter would be the one thing he could never control: betrayal. By 1935, Lucky Luciano's empire was at its most powerful, and its most fragile. The surface gleamed with success, a network of vice that ran like a well-oiled machine, profits flowing through the veins of the city, politicians paid off, cops kept quiet and rival bosses pacified. Yet beneath that polished surface, pressure was building, from both inside the underworld and the halls of justice. It was a hidden war, a silent conflict between loyalty and law, secrecy and exposure. Luciano had always believed that the Mafia's greatest weapon was invisibility. But now, that invisibility was beginning to fade. Newspapers whispered about a national crime syndicate. Detectives in New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia began comparing notes. And in the office of Manhattan District Attorney Thomas E. Dewey, a crusade was taking shape, a moral war against organized vice. Dewey was young, ambitious, and incorruptible, the exact opposite of every politician Luciano had ever bought. To Dewey, the mob wasn't just a local nuisance, it was a cancer on America's soul. At first, Luciano dismissed him. "Another headline chaser," he told Costello. "Let him talk. We'll still be here when the cameras move on." But Dewey was different. He wasn't after headlines, he was after results. And he had a plan: to destroy the Mafia not by shooting it but by proving it existed. His weapon wasn't a gun. It was evidence. Dewey started where Luciano was most vulnerable: prostitution. While the Mafia's gambling and labor rackets were shadowy and decentralized, prostitution was messy, visible, and emotional. The victims talked, the madams complained, and the girls, tired, exploited, and frightened, were easy to flip. Dewey's detectives raided brothels across Manhattan, rounding up hundreds of women. To most prosecutors this would have been a moral cleanup. To Dewey it was reconnaissance. He wasn't after the girls, he wanted the man behind them. Slowly, piece by piece, the puzzle began to take shape. The arrested women described a vast network: standardized fees, protection payments, collectors who came by each week, and even office ledgers. It wasn't random vice. It was business, organized, disciplined, and centralized. The combination that Luciano had built to control the city's brothels was finally visible through the eyes of those who worked for it. Luciano's mistake was his faith in structure. The same efficiency that made his empire so profitable also made it traceable. His organization was too well run, too cleanly documented, too dependent on communication. Dewey's team began linking names, addresses, and phone numbers until they reached the upper levels. Men like Dave Batillo, who handled day-to-day management, and his lieutenant, Ciro Terranova. Each arrest led to another. Each frightened witness led them closer to the top. When Dewey's men finally uttered the name Charles Luciano, it was whispered with both awe and disbelief. For years he had been untouchable, the ghost who ran New York. Now, for the first time, there was a trail that pointed directly to him. Dewey's office began preparing a case unlike any before, not against a single criminal act, but against an entire system of organized vice. Meanwhile, in Luciano's world, paranoia began to spread. The brothel raids were costing him money and credibility. His men were being questioned and some weren't holding up under pressure. A few of the madams, especially one named Cokie Flo Brown, were talking. She was loud, emotional, and furious at being abandoned by her protectors. Her testimony would later become one of the prosecution's key weapons. Luciano knew the heat was rising. He stopped using telephones, held meetings only in public restaurants, and limited who could see him. Even his closest allies noticed the change. Meyer Lansky urged him to go underground for a while, maybe even leave New York until things cooled down. But Lucky refused. "I built this city," he told Lansky. "I'm not running from it." What he didn't know was that Dewey was already preparing an arrest warrant. Using the testimonies of multiple witnesses and the evidence from dozens of brothel raids, Dewey announced a sweeping indictment: the people of the state of New York versus Charles "Lucky" Luciano. The charges, 62 counts of compulsory prostitution, were sensational. The newspapers went wild. Headlines screamed, "Vice King indicted. Luciano the mastermind of New York's brothels." For a man who had built his empire on secrecy, the exposure was a nightmare. The photos of Luciano handcuffed and surrounded by detectives were everywhere, a public humiliation unlike anything he had ever imagined. To the world, the invincible mob boss was just another criminal being dragged before the law. Behind the scenes, though, the war was still being fought. Luciano's allies scrambled to protect what was left of the business. Frank Costello worked the political channels, trying to apply pressure through sympathetic judges. Meyer Lansky handled damage control with the press, trying to shift the narrative away from Luciano personally. But it was too late. The prosecution had momentum and the public wanted blood. The hidden war wasn't just between Luciano and Dewey, it was within the Mafia itself. Vito Genovese, always opportunistic, began maneuvering to take control in Luciano's absence. He whispered to the commission that maybe Lucky had brought too much attention, that maybe a quieter, more traditional leadership was needed. To Luciano this was the ultimate betrayal, but he couldn't confront it. From the moment of his arrest, he was no longer the untouchable king. He was a defendant. The balance of power was shifting. In the underworld, men began taking sides. Some believed Luciano would beat the charges. After all, he had escaped worse. Others saw it as the beginning of the end. The Mafia had thrived on myth, the illusion that its leaders were beyond reach. Dewey's prosecution shattered that illusion. For the first time, the American public saw the face of organized crime, and the government had a name to match it. Luciano's mind, once sharp with confidence, turned inward. He began to question the very system he had built. The code of silence, the chain of loyalty. What good were they if the weakest link could still destroy the strongest man? Every woman who testified was another reminder that Omerta was not infallible. Fear could silence men, but desperation could make women speak. Still, even as the walls closed in, Luciano refused to show weakness. "They can't prove a thing," he told reporters. "They're making a movie, not a case." But deep down he understood that this was more than a legal battle, it was an ideological one. Dewey represented a new kind of America, moral, methodical, and relentless. Luciano represented the old one, cynical, corrupt, and pragmatic. It was the perfect storm, and neither man intended to back down. The hidden war had reached its turning point. The man who had once manipulated every system, criminal, political, and human, was now trapped inside one he couldn't control: the law. The game had changed. And for the first time, Lucky Luciano was playing defense. The fall didn't happen overnight. It came slowly, almost imperceptibly, like a shadow creeping across a room at sunset. For years, Lucky Luciano had been the architect of power, the invisible hand behind every racket in New York. But in 1936, the illusion of invincibility began to crumble. The government had built its case, the newspapers had their villain, and the man who once dictated the rules of the underworld found himself cornered. This was the beginning of his downfall, a fall that would expose not just his empire but the fragility of power itself. Luciano's arrest had been a spectacle. On April 1, 1936, detectives led by Dewey's special agents tracked him down to Hot Springs, Arkansas, a luxurious retreat where mobsters and politicians mingled freely under the illusion of safety. Luciano had fled New York briefly after rumors spread that the police were coming for him. But his movements were too public, his ego too large. Even in hiding he couldn't resist the luxury of his status. When the police finally entered the hotel lobby, Luciano didn't fight. He smiled, that same cold, confident grin that had unnerved rivals and detectives alike. "You boys sure traveled a long way," he said, lighting a cigarette as they cuffed him. The gesture was pure performance, as if to show that even in defeat, he remained in control. But inside something had shifted. For the first time, Lucky Luciano wasn't dictating the terms. The trip back to New York was humiliating. Reporters crowded the train stations, cameras flashed, headlines screamed, "Lucky Luciano caught, Vice King arrested in the South." To the public, it was poetic justice, the glamorous gangster finally paying for his sins. To Luciano it was personal betrayal. He had spent years buying silence, loyalty, and protection. Now, all of it had evaporated the moment his name became bad press. Politicians who once called him a businessman, now pretended they had never met him. Police captains who had taken his envelopes were suddenly proud patriots. The same system he had corrupted now turned on him for redemption. Back in New York, Dewey wasted no time. He knew this was more than a prosecution, it was a statement. The courtroom would be a stage and Luciano the villain in a national morality play. Dewey wanted to show the world that organized crime could be beaten with law and evidence, not bullets and fear. Luciano's legal team went into overdrive. They filed motions, challenged witnesses, and attacked the credibility of every woman who testified. But Dewey's case was airtight. He had built it brick by brick, 68 witnesses, hundreds of pages of testimony, and a narrative that made sense to the jury. Luciano was not just another gangster. He was the CEO of Vice, the mind behind the machinery of sin. Behind bars awaiting trial, Luciano's composure began to crack. He still dressed impeccably, still joked with guards, still carried himself like a boss. But inside, paranoia was eating him alive. He worried about who might be talking, who might be cutting deals. His entire system had been based on silence, on the certainty that fear would keep everyone loyal. But fear fades fast when survival's at stake. His closest men, like Dave Batillo and Ciro Terranova, were now facing their own indictments. Some stayed loyal. Others began to waver. The brothel madams, women like Cokie Flo Brown, Mildred Harris, and Dora Clark, became stars in Dewey's narrative. They testified in trembling voices about the beatings, the collections, and the names whispered by men in expensive suits. Every word chipped away at Luciano's myth of control. He tried to send messages from jail, quiet warnings, coded phrases meant to intimidate witnesses, but Dewey's office intercepted everything. The newspapers loved it. Every day, front pages carried new revelations: Luciano's web of vice, girls tell all, gang chief's secret empire exposed. Public opinion turned into a tidal wave, and Luciano was swept along helplessly. Yet even as he faced destruction, there was a part of him that admired the precision of his enemy. Dewey was everything he had once admired in himself: calm, methodical, strategic. In another life, Luciano might have respected him. But now Dewey was the executioner. As the trial approached, Luciano tried one last play: control through presence. When he entered the courtroom for the first time, he wore a tailored double-breasted suit, his hair slicked back, his expression unreadable. Reporters described him as the picture of confidence. But those who knew him saw the truth in the way his hands twitched slightly when he lit his cigarette. The man who had ruled through fear now looked at 12 strangers who held his fate in their hands. Inside the Mafia, the reaction was mixed. Some bosses sympathized, others celebrated. Vito Genovese, ever the opportunist, began to consolidate power quietly, presenting himself as the natural successor. "Lucky's time is over," he told associates. He built the machine. Now someone else has to drive it. Frank Costello, by contrast, tried to protect what was left of Luciano's influence, but even he knew the commission was drifting toward new leadership. Luciano was not just on trial for prostitution, he was on trial for arrogance, for power, for the illusion that he was untouchable. The same intelligence that built his empire now trapped him in its logic. He had made the Mafia too organized, too visible. In trying to control everything, he had left a paper trail of witnesses and routines that any determined prosecutor could follow. Late at night, in his cell at the Tombs, Luciano would lie awake staring at the ceiling. He had survived street wars, assassinations, betrayals, but this was different. There was no gun to pull, no deal to make, no face to threaten. His enemy was the law itself, and it couldn't be bribed, threatened, or charmed. It was steady, patient, and inevitable. In private conversations with Lansky, who remained free and operating, Luciano still clung to a shred of hope. "I'll beat this," he said. "They got nothing real." But Lansky, ever the realist, knew the storm had already passed. The empire was breaking apart, piece by piece. The fall of Lucky Luciano wasn't a single event, it was a process of unmasking. For years he had hidden behind systems, structures, and silence. Now every lie was being stripped away. The man who once ruled through invisibility was being forced into the light. As the trial loomed, there was no denying it anymore. The Kingmaker of the American underworld was standing on the edge of ruin. His fall had begun, not with a bullet but with testimony. Not in the shadows of gangland, but under the blinding lights of justice. The trial of Lucky Luciano was more than a courtroom drama, it was a public spectacle, a battle between two visions of America. On one side stood Thomas E. Dewey, the relentless young prosecutor representing law, reform, and order. On the other stood Charles Lucky Luciano, the man who had built an empire in the shadows, embodying the seductive glamour of power without rules. The courtroom became a stage where morality, ambition, and myth collided, and where, for the first time, Luciano found himself stripped of control. The trial began in May 1936 in the New York County Courthouse. Crowds gathered outside every morning, reporters jostling for photographs, women craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the notorious Vice King. The newspapers devoured every detail: what Luciano wore, how he looked, even the smirk he gave when the judge entered the room. He was in every sense a celebrity defendant, part villain, part folk hero. Luciano, always a master of presentation, came dressed like a Wall Street executive. His suits were immaculate, his hair perfectly parted, his expression calm. He believed that appearance was half the battle. If he looked like a businessman, perhaps the jury would see him as one. But Dewey wasn't interested in appearances. He had evidence, witnesses, records, and the careful logic of a man who understood how systems worked. Dewey opened with a simple but devastating argument: this man, Charles Luciano, is not a victim of circumstance. He is the architect of vice, the controller of an empire built on human misery. He spoke with precision, every word measured. His tone wasn't emotional, it was moral. He didn't need to prove that Luciano personally beat women or collected money, only that he controlled the men who did. In modern legal terms, Dewey was introducing the concept of enterprise responsibility, holding the boss accountable for the crimes of the organization he created. Luciano's lawyers countered with equal flair. They painted him as a businessman, a scapegoat, a man being punished for the crimes of others. They argued that the witnesses were unreliable, prostitutes and madams with every reason to lie, desperate for leniency or revenge. These women, one defense attorney thundered, would say anything for a lighter sentence and a taste of fame. It was a strategy aimed at discrediting the prosecution's human evidence while preserving Luciano's image as a dignified outsider to the dirty work. But Dewey anticipated this. One by one he brought in witnesses who told remarkably consistent stories. Women like Cokie Flo Brown and Mildred Harris took the stand, their voices shaking but firm. They described the system in detail: how the collectors came each week, how payments were recorded, how threats were delivered to anyone who fell behind. Their testimonies aligned with phone records, addresses, and ledgers seized during raids. It was the bureaucracy of crime laid bare. The courtroom atmosphere was electric. Each revelation chipped away at Luciano's carefully crafted facade. He sat at the defense table, impassive, but his eyes flickered with anger each time a witness mentioned his name. He hated the feeling of being observed, dissected, defined by others. For years he had been the one in control, the one who decided who lived, who died, who spoke. Now he was the object of scrutiny, and the law was watching him like a specimen. Outside the courtroom, the media frenzy reached fever pitch. Dewey was hailed as a crusader, a modern-day knight fighting corruption. Luciano was painted as both a devil and a fallen prince. The headlines fed on the contrast: Dewey versus Lucky, the battle for New York's soul. Every testimony, every piece of evidence became a headline. The more Dewey pressed, the more Luciano's mystique grew, but so did his vulnerability. Dewey's brilliance lay in framing the case not just as a crime, but as a system of corruption. He portrayed Luciano as the unseen puppeteer, the man who had turned New York into a city of sin for profit. He showed the jury that every dollar earned in a brothel eventually led to him. And when the defense tried to claim there was no direct evidence, Dewey delivered his masterstroke: you don't have to see the general pull the trigger to know he commands the army. The trial lasted nearly 2 months, and by the end even Luciano's confidence began to waver. He spent nights pacing in his cell, reading the newspapers, memorizing the faces of jurors, wondering who might be swayed by power and who by righteousness. His defense team urged him to consider a deal, but Lucky refused. "If I go down," he said, "I go down standing." On June 6, 1936, the jury delivered its verdict: guilty on 62 counts of compulsory prostitution. The courtroom erupted. Dewey didn't smile. He simply nodded as if confirming what he had known all along. Luciano sat motionless, his jaw tight, his hands folded. For the first time in his adult life, he couldn't negotiate his way out of a problem. When the judge read the sentence, 30 to 50 years in state prison, a murmur rippled through the courtroom. Even seasoned reporters were stunned. It was the harshest sentence ever given for such charges. To many it was excessive. To Dewey it was necessary, a message to every gangster who believed himself untouchable. Luciano's composure cracked only once. As the guards led him away, he turned to one of his attorneys and muttered, "They can lock me up, but they can't lock up my friends." It was bravado, but underneath it lay a bitter truth. He didn't know anymore who his friends were. In the weeks that followed, America celebrated Dewey as a hero. His career skyrocketed. He would go on to become New York's governor and even run for president. Luciano, meanwhile, was sent to Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, a maximum security prison nicknamed Little Siberia, for its isolation and cold. The man who had once ruled Manhattan's nightlife was now just another inmate in a gray uniform. But even behind bars, the legend of Lucky Luciano only grew. The newspapers called him the Phantom Boss. Songs were written about him, movies inspired by him. He was no longer just a criminal, he was mythology. Yet for Luciano himself, it was no comfort. The silence of his cell was louder than any applause. He had always believed that power could bend any system, that money, charm, and fear could buy loyalty and silence. But the trial had shown him something else entirely, that systems, once provoked, fight back. The law had become what he himself once was: organized, disciplined, and relentless. The fall was complete. The empire he had built was now a cautionary tale. And the man who had made the Mafia modern was learning what it meant to live without power. Prison was supposed to be the end of Lucky Luciano's story. The newspapers said he was finished, that the once great king of New York's underworld had finally been buried behind cold stone walls. But Luciano was never the kind of man who accepted endings written by others. Even in chains he remained what he had always been: a strategist, a manipulator, a man who understood that true power doesn't vanish when you lose your throne. It adapts. It hides. It waits. When Luciano arrived at Clinton Correctional Facility in upstate New York, the infamous Little Siberia, he was met not with reverence, but with the bleak indifference of prison life. The guards treated him like any other inmate. The cold bit through his clothes. The walls smelled of mildew and sweat. It was a place built to erase men. Yet from the moment he stepped inside, Luciano began to rebuild, not an empire of territory or violence, but of influence. He understood the rules immediately: control information, control people. Within weeks, he had befriended guards, earned the respect of fellow inmates, and established quiet channels of communication to the outside world. Even in prison he managed to dress better than most. A clean shirt, polished shoes, small privileges obtained through charm and barter. His demeanor was calm, detached, almost regal. Other inmates called him the boss. But Luciano was not delusional. He knew his freedom was gone, perhaps forever. The weight of a 30 to 50-year sentence was suffocating. In rare moments of solitude, he'd sit by the small, barred window of his cell, watching the snow fall across the gray yard. He would think about the life he had built, the luxury apartments, the restaurants, the nights of laughter and money flowing like wine, and how far it all seemed now. The isolation gnawed at him, but so did something deeper: the knowledge that his own creation had outgrown him. The Mafia Commission, his brainchild, continued to operate smoothly without him. Men like Frank Costello, Joe Adonis, and Vito Genovese were still out there, still making deals, still using the system Luciano had designed. In a strange way he had achieved his dream. He had made the Mafia self-sustaining, a business that could survive even without its founder. But that very success was a double-edged sword. The organization no longer needed him. And for a man like Lucky Luciano, irrelevance was worse than captivity. Still, he found ways to stay connected. Through a complex web of lawyers, family visits, and coded letters, Luciano maintained communication with Costello and Meyer Lansky. They updated him on operations, sought his advice, and occasionally sent money or gifts to ease his conditions. It was an arrangement built on respect, and perhaps guilt. They knew that without Luciano none of them would be where they were. His relationship with Lansky remained the most genuine. Lansky was pragmatic, loyal in his own quiet way. He once told an associate, "Lucky built the foundation. The least we can do is keep it standing." Lansky often visited under the pretense of legal business, using the opportunity to discuss strategy. Together they kept the illusion alive that Luciano still had a say in the direction of things. Inside the prison, Luciano's presence transformed the atmosphere. Inmates who once fought over scraps now listened to his quiet authority. He organized peace among the rival groups, set up informal gambling rings, and even convinced guards to allow small favors in exchange for discipline and order. To many, it seemed like the Mafia had extended its reach into the very heart of the penitentiary. Yet for all his influence there were nights when the mask slipped. Alone in his cell, Lucky would sometimes think of betrayal, not the betrayal of friends or witnesses but of time itself. Time was the one thing he couldn't control. It moved forward relentlessly, carrying the world away from him. The suits he once wore would go out of fashion. The streets he ruled would change names. The young gangsters who invoked his name would never know the man behind it. Still, fate had one more twist to offer him. In 1942, the United States entered World War II, and the government found itself facing an unexpected problem. German submarines were sabotaging ships along the East Coast. The docks of New York, controlled by organized crime for decades, had become a national security risk. The Navy needed information and fast. That's when someone suggested a desperate, unlikely idea: enlist the Mafia. Operation Underworld was born. The Office of Naval Intelligence reached out to Meyer Lansky, who in turn contacted Lucky Luciano. From his prison cell, Luciano struck a deal. He would use his influence to ensure cooperation along the docks in exchange for leniency. Through intermediaries, he sent word to key Mafia figures to protect supply lines, prevent sabotage, and even gather intelligence on Italian ports when the Allies prepared to invade Sicily. It was one of the most extraordinary alliances in American history, the government partnering with the man it had once branded the nation's greatest criminal. Dewey, the same prosecutor who had sent Luciano away, now quietly endorsed the deal behind closed doors. The irony was staggering. Luciano's role in the operation was indirect, but crucial. His connections in Sicily provided information to U.S. forces, and his influence ensured dock workers remained cooperative. By 1943, reports indicated that sabotage along the New York waterfront had virtually disappeared. The Mafia, under Luciano's distant command, had effectively become a tool of wartime patriotism. When the war ended, Luciano's cooperation became the foundation of a campaign for his release. His lawyers argued that his service to the country warranted clemency. Dewey, now governor of New York, faced a dilemma: uphold justice or acknowledge the unspoken debt owed to the underworld. In 1946, he chose pragmatism over pride. Luciano's sentence was commuted, on one condition. He was to be deported immediately to Italy. When guards came to tell him, Luciano simply nodded. "So that's it, huh?" he said quietly. After 9 years behind bars, he was a free man, but not an American one. He had traded one prison for another, exchanging concrete walls for the invisible barrier of exile. As he prepared to leave, some inmates shook his hand. Others just stared. One young prisoner asked him what freedom felt like after all those years. Luciano paused, then said, "Kid, freedom's just another kind of cage. It depends on what you do with it." In the winter of 1946, Charles Lucky Luciano boarded a ship bound for Naples. Behind him lay the country he had shaped, corrupted, and served, a nation that had needed his cunning as much as it condemned it. Ahead lay uncertainty. He was no longer the boss of bosses, no longer the king of Manhattan. But even stripped of power, reputation, and country, Lucky Luciano still carried the one thing no one could take from him: the instinct to survive. The ship carrying Charles Lucky Luciano back to Italy sailed across the Atlantic under gray skies, a fitting image for a man leaving behind the empire he built and the world that had once feared his name. On February 9, 1946, the ship Laura Keene arrived in Naples, and as Luciano stepped onto the dock, photographers swarmed to capture the moment. His expression was unreadable, somewhere between pride and bitterness. America had given him everything: power, wealth, and legend, and now it had taken it all away. Italy, in contrast, felt alien. The streets were narrow and scarred from war. The country was still reeling from fascism's collapse, and poverty was everywhere. For the first time in decades, Luciano was no one special. To the Italian police he was a criminal. To the local mafia he was a curiosity, a man whose name carried weight but whose reach no longer extended across oceans. He settled first in Naples, renting a modest apartment overlooking the harbor. Gone were the tailored suits and the Manhattan skyline. Instead there were peeling walls, clattering trams, and the faint smell of salt and smoke. But Lucky, ever the strategist, began to rebuild, quietly, patiently, like a man who refused to fade into obscurity. The Italian authorities monitored his every move. He was followed by police agents, interrogated regularly, and forbidden from traveling without permission. Yet even under surveillance, Luciano found ways to reconnect with the underworld. His reputation drew visitors from all over Europe: Sicilian bosses, Corsican smugglers, French fixers. They came to pay respects to the man who had once been the architect of organized crime in America. It was during this time that Luciano found a new role for himself, not as a ruler but as a mediator, a counselor. From his apartment in Naples, he began facilitating connections between Italian and American syndicates, laying the early groundwork for what would later be known as the French Connection, the heroin trade that flowed from Turkey through Marseille to the United States. Luciano didn't handle drugs himself, at least not directly. He hated the chaos and moral decay that narcotics brought. But he saw opportunity. He saw a new world order emerging, one where global trade routes replaced street corners and businessmen replaced killers. "It's not about the gun anymore," he once said to an associate. "It's about the shipment, the signature, and the silence." In many ways this was his second empire, an invisible one, run through influence and advice rather than orders. He was no longer the young, brash Luciano who ruled by fear. This was a man who understood that real power could exist in suggestion. When younger mobsters came to him for guidance, he spoke with the calm authority of a patriarch. "You want to live long?" he told one. "Don't make enemies. Make partners." Despite his quiet return to the shadows, the U.S. government remained suspicious. American newspapers published stories accusing Luciano of rebuilding his drug empire from exile. The FBI monitored his contacts, and the Italian government, under U.S. pressure, briefly detained him several times. But no hard evidence ever surfaced. Luciano had become a ghost, too careful, too experienced to leave trails. Still, exile took its toll. The man who once commanded rooms now found himself eating dinner alone, staring at photographs of a world that no longer existed. In letters to old friends he wrote of feeling forgotten. "They remember the name," he said in one note, "but not the man." He missed the rhythm of New York, the jazz clubs, the laughter, the cigarette smoke curling through night air. Naples, with its beauty and decay, felt like a reflection of his own soul, alive yet haunted. In 1949 he made a daring attempt to start anew. Using intermediaries, Luciano invested in a string of hotels and casinos in Havana, Cuba, where his old friend Meyer Lansky had built a thriving gambling empire under the protection of dictator Fulgencio Batista. For a brief moment, it seemed like the old Lucky was back, walking through casino floors, greeting guests, shaking hands with politicians and mobsters alike. Havana in the late 1940s was paradise for men like him. Money flowed freely and the city pulsed with jazz, champagne, and sin. Luciano became a shadow investor, a behind-the-scenes power broker. For a time he believed he had found his way back into the game. But the illusion didn't last. The U.S. government soon learned of his presence and pressured Batista to expel him. In 1947, after a brief arrest and interrogation, Luciano was deported once more, this time back to Italy for good. That expulsion broke something inside him. Back in Naples, his health began to decline. The years of stress, prison, and exile had worn him down. His hair had gone gray, his once youthful face lined with regret. He spent his days walking along the waterfront, feeding pigeons, and talking with locals who barely recognized the legend sitting beside them. And yet, even in old age, the underworld still came knocking. Younger mobsters, both Sicilian and American, continued to visit him for advice. To them, Lucky Luciano wasn't just a man. He was a living myth, the godfather before the word existed. He listened to their stories, warned them about arrogance and betrayal, and occasionally smiled when they reminded him of his younger self. In his later years, Luciano's thoughts turned philosophical. He spoke often about fate, how chance, luck, and timing shaped everything. "They call me lucky," he once told a reporter, "but luck's only the name people give to the things they don't understand." He began to reflect on his own life not as a tragedy, but as an inevitability, a rise and fall written into the very nature of ambition. Despite his isolation, there were flashes of the old charm. He developed a relationship with Luciano, a beautiful Italian singer who became his companion in his final years. She brought warmth to his otherwise lonely world. With her, he found something resembling peace. But even that happiness was fleeting. Igea's health declined and she died in 1958, leaving Luciano heartbroken and more alone than ever. By the early 1960s, Luciano was no longer feared, but he was still respected. His name had become legend, whispered in criminal circles, studied by lawmen, immortalized by journalists. He had become what he always wanted, unforgettable. On January 26, 1962, Luciano was scheduled to meet with a film producer at the Naples airport to discuss a potential movie about his life. He arrived dressed impeccably as if reclaiming the dignity of his youth. The two men spoke briefly, shook hands, and as Luciano turned to leave he suddenly collapsed. A heart attack. The great Lucky Luciano died instantly, lying on the cold stone floor of the airport he had entered as a free man 16 years earlier. His death made headlines around the world. Even in New York, where his empire had long vanished, people paused. For some, he was a criminal who had gotten what he deserved. For others, he was a pioneer, the man who had turned chaos into order, violence into business. When his body was returned to America for burial in St. John's Cemetery in Queens, thousands came to pay their respects. Old gangsters, young hustlers, curious onlookers, all drawn by the myth. As the coffin was lowered into the ground, Meyer Lansky is said to have whispered, "He built it all. We just kept it running." In the end, Lucky Luciano's exile had been both punishment and redemption. He had lost his empire but gained perspective. He had been betrayed by his own ambition yet vindicated by history. The exile was his endgame, not the fall of a man, but the quiet evolution of one who finally understood the cost of power. Lucky Luciano's legacy is carved deep into the bones of modern organized crime. He didn't just rule, he redesigned the very structure of the Mafia, turning it from chaotic street warfare into a disciplined, corporate-style syndicate. His creation of the Commission ensured balance, order, and profit, principles that would guide crime families for decades. Long after his exile and death, his influence lingered. The systems he built survived wars, assassinations, and generational shifts. Under his model, violence became policy, loyalty became currency, and the Mafia became invisible, thriving under calm calculation instead of open brutality. Yet Luciano's impact reached far beyond the underworld. Law enforcement learned from him too, developing enterprise prosecution and the RICO Act to target leaders who ruled through structure rather than bloodshed. Even his enemies borrowed his logic. Culturally, he became myth. Films like The Godfather and Goodfellas echo his blueprint, the charming, strategic Don who controls chaos through intellect. But behind the myth was tragedy, a man who built loyalty from fear, power from betrayal, and an empire that ultimately consumed him. In the end, Luciano's story became the paradox of power itself. He was both builder and destroyer, visionary and villain. He left behind a world shaped in his image, and a warning written in silence. No empire lasts forever. The legend of Lucky Luciano ends not with a gunshot, but with a whisper, a man collapsing in an Italian airport far from the empire he built. Yet even in death, his presence lingers. His name remains shorthand for organized power, a symbol of control carved from chaos. Luciano's life was the American dream turned inside out, the immigrant who rose from poverty to rule the streets, only to lose everything chasing respect. He wanted order in a world of disorder and he achieved it, but at the cost of his soul. He wasn't just a criminal, he was a mirror. His story exposed the blurred lines between corruption and legitimacy, ambition and morality. His genius lay not in violence but in vision, understanding that perception itself was power. In the end, Luciano's empire faded, but his legacy endured. In the systems of crime he engineered, the laws created to destroy them, and the stories that refused to die. He remains both myth and warning, proof that control is temporary and power always asks for payment. As the curtain falls, we're left with the final image, an aging man in exile, staring toward the sea, haunted by the ghosts of his own creation. Power never lasts but legend does. And Lucky Luciano became both.